everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. While we've spent a good amount of time on Attendance Bias discussing the fall 1995 tour, there is a short southeast swing after the Quadrophenia Halloween show that we've never touched on, and I have to admit, I don't think I've ever listened to it. After Halloween in Chicago, the band took an 8-day break and then played 3 nights in Atlanta before 4 consecutive nights traveling and playing shows in the state of Florida. Today's guest, Matthew Wheelwright, is here to tell us about one of those shows, November 14th, 1995, at the University of Central Florida Arena in Orlando. Matthew is an ideal guest to tell us about this outstanding show from Fall 95. He's seen a ton of shows since 1990. He is a knowledgeable fan who can tell about the show both in real time and in context of Phish history. Plus, he is just as excited to talk about the show today in 2024 as he was 19 years ago when it was played. Not only does the audience recording from this show sound pristine, but there's plenty to highlight. A psychedelic version of Free, a fully acoustic I'm Blue, I'm Lonesome, and the best known part of this show, an insane sequence that kicks off with Stash and goes in and out of several segments before closing with You Enjoy Myself. But all of that just scratches the surface. Let's join Matthew to talk about band dynamics, clean-cut college kids, and why you should thank a taper today as we discuss Phish's show from November 14th, 1995 at the UCF Arena in Orlando. Matthew, welcome to Attendance Bias. Good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you? It's a pleasure to be on here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm doing very well. I'm excited for the end of the Phish summer tour, which is when we're recording here toward the end of the summer of 2024. So a lot to look forward to starting tonight. But we're not in 2024 for the next hour plus or so. We are going back to fall 95, and the date that you selected to discuss today, November 14th, 1995 at the University of Central Florida Arena in Orlando. So before we get off to anything, Matt, I have to ask you, the University of Central Florida Arena, is that still around? I haven't heard of that as a venue. I've heard of UCF, of course, but is that still a venue?
You know, I don't know if it's still a venue. It's the only time I've ever been on that campus, obviously. You know, I didn't even think to look that up, but at the time it was interesting because it was that year they're playing these big arenas, and when they did the Southern run after the Rosemont show, they were playing in much smaller spots. And this was a tiny basketball gym. I mean, it was tiny, and we'll get into how the taper section was in a different spot. I mean, the whole thing was very different or atypical than normal Phish shows.
I can't wait to hear all about that. I have no idea about the taper spot. In my mind, it's always been in the same exact space, right in front of the soundboard. So those little details like that, I eat it up with a spoon. So we'll hold on to it right now. But before we get to the little minute details like that, let's give an overview profile of you as a Phish fan, Matthew, with today's Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Matthew, when was your first Phish show, and what do you remember from it?
My first Phish show was September 28th, 1990 at the Chance in Poughkeepsie, New York. And what I remember about it was the Chance was this small little vaudeville club in Poughkeepsie where a lot of bands either played there on their way up to stardom or on their way down kind of thing. And Phish, I think this was their third time playing at the venue. And I was 14 at the time, but I worked at a delicatessen where the owner's brother ran security. So he would kind of let me in the side door to see like these bands. You know, I'm seeing a lot of heavy metal and prog at the time. And he said, Matthew, you got to come see this band. There's this weird band. They're kind of like a nerdy prog rock band, but the drummer plays a vacuum and wears a dress. It's right up your alley, because he thought I was a little weirdo, which I probably was at the time, you know?
Well, he's dead on. He's right on. That's a good apt description of the band.
Yeah, and so I remember the crowd being mostly, you know, at the time, there was not really a hippie element. And it looked like to me like a lot of nerdy college kids. Sweaters with a collar over the sweater. But you could tell a lot of people, I could smell weed in the audience, not as prevalent as it became, but I just remember it was half filled. And it seemed like everyone was in on a lot of inside jokes kind of thing, like I felt kind of on the outside. And it was interesting because most bands, the drummers behind the band, this time, Phish is set up on stage left and they're all like on an equal footing. And at the time, I'm in ninth grade, and I'm a school band nerd. So I'm in like the concert band, the jazz band, and the thing that blew me away is that they're playing like this weird, involved, like proggy, complicated rock with a piano instead of like a keyboard, like a synthesizer. But then they played "Take the A Train," which really came out of left field and blew my mind. I'm thinking, wow, they're playing this weird stuff in like odd time signatures, but then they're playing an old Duke Ellington jazz standard. This is really bizarre. And I just couldn't put my finger, like it clicked. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard at the time.
I love that, especially the part where it remains true today, where people who like Phish generally come from all sorts of musical pedigrees. A lot of people, the old phrase was, I come for the prog, I stay for the jams. Or there are people who came over from the Grateful Dead side of things, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, due to this 1995 show.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to say it doesn't matter what you were into first, because I was into classic rock, and Phish to me appealed to that side of their sound when I first got into them.
God, yeah.
That their covers, especially talking again about 95, that when I found out that they covered Quadrophenia, I was like, oh, this band is for me. And so it doesn't matter. You said that at the time you were listening to a lot of metal. Were there any particular songs that you remember that kind of hooked you from that angle, or was it just you just had a wide musical vocabulary at the time?
I was really into, I would say my two favorite bands at that point were Rush and Metallica. So at that time it was, it's pre-Black Album, but just off the Injustice for All. And I was really into, I felt that when I discovered Rush, it made me, I felt like above people, like, oh, I'm listening to this, fancy rock band they seemed more complicated and than your typical rock and roll at the time. So I kind of went from like AC/DC, Van Halen, Metallica, Megadeth, then all of a sudden and Justice for All and Queensryche and all these sort of things. And at the deli I worked at, we would take turns in playing music, and I would play Rush, and it would drive them crazy because they couldn't stand Geddy Lee and the whole thing. And let me just looking at the set list really quick of this show, which I probably should have pulled up beforehand. So the first song, they opened up with The Landladies. So that's my first Phish song. I just thought that they were covering like a Carlos Santana song, because The Landlady alone, I mean, Trey is just basically, that's like his tribute, in my opinion, to Carlos. Those sustained note bends that's Carlos in a nutshell right there. And then the Latin piano and the Latin beats and everything, I'm like, this is amazing. And then the bouncing part, I'm thinking, this is kind of bizarre. But really, what I thought was amazing about bouncing is all four of them were singing the same verse, but one note behind each other. So it was like this weird vocal thing that I had never seen or heard before. And I'm thinking, these guys are like professors of music, but they look like the biggest bunch of nerds. So I'm thinking, well, I know what they're going to do if their career doesn't work. They're obviously going to become music teachers kind of thing, The thing that really stuck out to me was Page, because at the time, being a heavy metal nerd, the only keyboards you would hear were these like blazing synth lines. But then Page actually has, it was like one of those Yamaha like pianos. It wasn't like an electric keyboard. The thing that really stuck out, because he was going off on stuff, especially during like Susie Greenberg. I mean, the breakdown where he does the whole piano thing. And I'm like, wow, this guy's incredible. And being a music nerd in band, we're listening to a lot of orchestration stuff. And Page is what really stuck out to me more than anything. I mean, obviously you could tell they're all competent musicians, but Page really blew my mind, because I'd never seen a band with a piano player before. Really.
I love hearing that, because when you mentioned earlier, you name checked Rush and Metallica. To me, I would have automatically assumed incorrectly that it would be Fishman that would have grabbed your attention. Because to me, when I hear Rush and Metallica, I automatically think of the drums.
Well, I'm a drummer, and I'm a big at this time. This is when I'm taking drum lessons. I mean, drums are my whole life. So when I discovered Neil Peart, I was like, it blew my mind. So like Bonham, Neil Peart, Dave Lombardo, like all the 80s thrash bands, the thing that really appealed to me was like the double bass drums. And to me, it was like mind-boggling. And the funny thing with Phish was the first band that I became like a really mega fan of, where the drummer wasn't my main focus for some reason. I knew that Fishman was good, but it was Trey and Page that really got me so into the band. And it wasn't until later that I really, really picked up on the genius of Fishman. And I still think Fishman is what separates them from most bands because of his weird, like crab-like style of playing, you know? And then when I tried to play Phish covers with people, then I'm thinking, wow, Fishman is unlike any other drummer. But they were the first band where it wasn't the drums that really drew me in.
Well, talking about a little bit later, what was your most recent show and what did you think of it?
Well, the most recent Phish show was the Sci-Fi Soldier show in, I guess, 2021. That's the last time I saw the band. So I kind of look at that whole Vegas run as a whole, but that Sci-Fi Soldier set, I don't know what my thoughts were at the time. Just seeing them in like their soldier outfits, and it was weird because the COVID thing was still happening. But I just thought it was so over the top, the way that they started approaching the Halloween shows, where instead of just covering an album, they would make up like a fake band. And this was like the future drawing on the Cosmo Fox thing. And I'm still not sure what to make of that set, honestly. But that whole run as a whole, I thought is some of the more peak Phish of like the current era, especially the first two nights at Vegas, I think are just incredible shows. You know, the Number show and the night after, et cetera.
It was the Animals, right? Also?
Yeah, it went Numbers, then there was a normal Phish show, and then the 30th was the Animals theme show kind of thing. And it seemed like they were trying to like screw with everybody, making everyone think that they're going to play Pink Floyd Animals the next night, or at least that's what I thought that they were trying to do anyway. Like they love to throw everybody off.
Today, if someone came to you for a recommendation, they said, Matthew, I know you're into this Phish band. I've heard all about them, but I've never heard any of their music. Would you be able to pick one studio album and one live show that you would give to them to get them drawn in?
Well, depending on the someone, if it's someone who plays music, like a musician who just doesn't get the whole thing, I would probably throw them Picture of Nectar, just on the fact that the musicianship, they basically touch every style of music with that, like from funk to calypso to the Carlos Santana thing with Stash and all that. A musician, even Mike is slapping the hell out of the bass during that album, which he's gotten away from. And if it's a non-musician fan, I would probably throw Billy Breathes to them.
Yeah, Billy Breathes is very accessible for sure.
Yeah, and then if it's a live show, I always in the past would throw someone Worcester 93, because it was a great FM broadcast and it gives you everything. Or Red Rocks 94, that FM that's, the famous 94, and that just, you get everything from that show. Because a lot of the time someone will hear, oh, you're a Phish fan, and they'll go on Spotify and hear Waiting in the Velvet Sea or Waste or something like that. And they're like, this is the band you've seen almost 300 times, really? And I'm like, no, you have to understand, go listen to a live show. And then, it's a hard band to really give to what I call like a normie, if you will.
I agree. If you had a time machine and you could go back to witness any Phish moment, whether it was on stage or even like a conversation off stage or a decision that was made, when or where would you go?
I would easily go to the sunset or sunrise at Big Cypress. That whole thing was just magical, watching the sun come up and watching them play, do like the Harry Hood fake out or the 2001 fake out. Is that what they did? From what I remember.
I'll do the fact check.
Yeah. And then it would have to be this show that we're talking to tonight, my conversation with Mike Gordon before the show.
Oh, well, we'll get there for sure. Before we do, what is your favorite post-show snack?
My favorite post-show snack, if I could do it, I'd like to have either a chicken or an eggplant parm sandwich ready to go after the show with a nice cold drink.
Wow, good answer. Strong. Finally, all things considered, I know that weird is normal at Phish, but considering the circumstances, what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
Deer Creek 97, the first night in the lawn, I saw basically a menage a trois going on. I think it was a man and two girls, or maybe two wooks and a girl, basically having a threesome going on, which we all kind of looked over and said, is that really happening? And it was during that Monster Cities that they played. And it was right during the Doobie Brothers tease of listen to the music. And a bunch of people started looking and thinking, oh my God. But the non-X-rated version would be Walnut Creek 97, the lightning strike during Taste. I mean, we were so close to the lightning strike, you could literally see the flame coming off of it. I've never been that close to a lightning strike before. That was unbelievable.
You know, when I heard that, or I found out that they were releasing that show on DVD, I have to imagine, even though it's a great show musically, that part of it has to do with that, with the visuals and what it was like to be there. You know, that was part of maybe the decision. I don't know that at all. That's just when I heard it on tape, it wasn't great because it was just a lot of booms, right? And a lot of big cheers from the crowd. But when you see it on video, it's really like being in a planetarium. Like it envelops you and it gives you that small sense of what it was like to be there. Maybe just a minor feeling of that.
I know the show is released and everything, but to all the listeners, seek out the audience recording for that specific taste, because you can really hear the thunder kind of as the first set is going. It's pouring rain, and as it gets closer to the taste, you can hear the thunder getting louder and louder, and then that boom, the whole crowd just erupts from that specific lightning strike. It's kind of dangerous, actually.
Yeah, quite.
Just a little bit.
When was this show played?
So today's show was played on November 14th, 1995 at the University of Central Florida Arena. I am not surprised that another show from the Fall 95 tour has been chosen. It's creeping up in terms of the attendance bias world. It's creeping up on Summer 99 of the most chosen tour. To take a look at the Fall 95 tour, a lot has been said about it. It is a legendary tour in Phish history with 54 shows, started in late September, went all the way to December. And some Fall 95 shows that have already been covered on this podcast include Halloween 95, December 1st in Hershey, October 11th at the Compton Terrace Amphitheater, December 11th at the CCCC in Maine, October 8th in Missoula, Montana, and if you count it, New Year's Eve at Madison Square Garden. What do you think it says, Matthew, about the band and about the fan base that so many fans go all the way back to 1995? In your view, what was it about this tour that makes it so instantly memorable that people who have seen dozens, hundreds of shows go to this one when they could pick any to talk about?
I think, especially for people my age and your age and that Gen X, portion of the fan base, most people at that time were either in college or just out of college. And especially in the Northeast, Phish played so often up there that, at that point you had a lot of shows under your belt. And that's really my opinion is that that's like right in the midst of their peak. And at that point, you couldn't really get to a bad show if you tried. Like every night, it just seemed like it was better and better. And especially that tour just got better and better. It started off a little weird and then kind of just got stronger and stronger and stronger. And I know that December of 95 is one of the key peak months in Phish history, but I will put this Orlando show right up against Hershey, Binghamton, and the whole New Year's Eve run. I mean, I think you could really put this up there with any of those shows.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote that it seems like this is the kind of tour where every night you saw them, you could argue that it was better than the night before, even if you saw them for 10 shows in a row.
Yeah, I mean, I have this theory that from the April West Coast tour in 1992 all the way through the Island tour, that from April 92 to April 98, I feel that Phish was unstoppable. They were like a snowball going down a hill that just kept getting better and better. And each tour, they changed a little bit. The song book wasn't diluted with the mediocrity you could argue that it's been in the last, so many years. And they didn't really have many clunkers in the song book at the time. And they were each tour brought like a different style from like summer 95 to fall 95 was, they had new songs and the playing was different. They're playing new arenas and they're trying to perfect the arena rock thing. And, then we could go on to each tour, but you get what I'm saying.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, the part about trying to perfect the arena rock, which is kind of, in my view, what Quadrophenia was all about. Right?
Oh, yeah.
The Who, the ultimate arena rock band. But this was also a tour, the 95 as a year, but also specifically the end of 1995, when Phish was kind of coming into themselves as an organization, professionally speaking. It was kind of a DIY operation in 94, certainly in the era that you were talking about, 92, 93. But after this tour, after the fall 95, inclusive of the New Year's run, starting in 96, then they didn't have to really worry about booking shows anymore or selling tickets, right? They weren't having their independent promoter doing it. They were now in the industry, but they were less independent. They were more industry in terms of professional touring act. They didn't change their ethos, but it did change their standing in the music world. From here on out, it was arenas and top venues, pretty much, not always, but pretty much coast to coast. I mean, when you think about it in context of the larger music world and quote unquote jam band scene, right? The Grateful Dead were no longer around.
Right.
Dave Matthews Band had crossed over into the mainstream. They were already playing Giant Stadium in 1997 or 1998. So they were beyond.
Insane.
Yeah, it was insane. I saw Dave Matthews Band at Jones Beach, I think in 95 and 96. And both of those shows were sold out. By 98, they were playing Giant Stadium. So they were already kind of past the innovative Phish jam band scene. They were gone, to their credit, right? This isn't a criticism of Dave Matthews Band. They do their thing and they're still doing it. But when it came to the jam band community, Phish was now the top dog.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even close. I'm just trying to think of their peers at the time. Like, I guess Phish, Panic, and then there's like the smaller bands. I feel like ARU had changed at that point. Bruce left ARU. The Blues Traveler got mainstream notoriety.
But for a hot second, right? Blues Traveler, more than one tour. Like, they were maybe headlining the Horde Festival, but they weren't selling out Madison Square Garden.
No, they just did that that one time. But yeah, Phish's peers at that time it was Phish, and then I'm trying to think. Mo, I guess. I'm just trying to think back then. There was Phish, and then you didn't really have the Disco Biscuit started. Mo, then you just, depending on what part of the country you were, Leftover Salmon started their thing. But at that point, Phish was really the big jam band, especially on Rolling Stone wasn't doing articles on Mo or Leftover Salmon, that sort of thing.
Right, because you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you brought up the Chance in Schenectady.
Poughkeepsie.
Poughkeepsie, I'm sorry, not Schenectady. You brought up the Chance. That's a venue, when I think of it, I think of seeing Mo there or Dark Star Orchestra there. Bands that reach a certain point and don't go too far above or below it. Phish, like you said, were on their way up. They didn't come back down to it.
Yeah, they graduated from the Chance 4 times, and then the next they moved up to the Mid-Hudson Civic Center, which was like a 4,000 seat, municipal big box of a room. And then 1994, they're going from the Beacon Theater to MSG. I mean, it was pretty unreal to watch their gradual rise.
So for all of the shows that you've seen, and it sounds like you've seen your share, more than your share, what about this show, November 14th, 95, when you reached out to me, stood out in your mind and still stands out in your mind?
I did. After the Rosemont show, they took a little break and they came down to the South. And I had just started going to college down in Florida, in the Tampa area. And we went up and did the Fox Theater run. And then we came and saw them at Gainesville. There was a night off. And the thing that struck me, that whole run of shows were great. But the Orlando show just seemed to be on the net, like a different level. Not every other show was killer, but this show just seemed to really step up to the next level. And before that little run, I saw the New Orleans show with Medeski, Martin, and Wood opening, which is a whole other ball of wax. So it was still like the last time that they're in small little theaters. But this Orlando show just seemed that they were really on this telepathic connection with each other. You know, they didn't even have to look at each other. As you could hear during the show, they're kind of giggling. There's a couple little things that they're doing that are atypical. And I took a friend of mine who had never really heard Phish, who was a big monster musician in the Tampa area, and his mind was blown. He just couldn't believe what he was seeing.
Set 1.
Well, let's dig into this show. Set 1 opens with Chalkdust Torture. The first thing I thought is killer opener, and the second thought I had is this audience recording sounds amazing. Amazing. This is my favorite type of recording. I know with the advent of live Phish that a lot of people prefer soundboards, and when I was getting into the band, it was the holy grail to come across a soundboard. Since doing this podcast, I've kind of come full circle where I almost prefer either audience recordings or matrix recordings to soundboards. And this is a perfect example why. So you mentioned that the taping section was a little bit different at this show compared to others. What did it look like? Where was it?
When we walked into the venue, you know, I mean, that tour of 95, if you remember, there was a big chessboard hanging behind the band because they're doing the whole playing the chess and playing the audience and chess thing. And usually I noticed that Paul's desk was all the way in the back against the wall. And this was a tiny basketball gym. There could have been more than 700 people in the venue. And I'm thinking, where's the taper section? So that what they did is they put the taper section on the second level all the way on both sides of stage left and stage right on the second level. So it was very close to the PA, the hanging PA that they have in a concert. It was very close to the PA. So if the taper knew what he was doing, shout out Jim Charna, he was the taper I knew at the time, and his mics were so close to the PA system. And if you think about it, this audience recording is on par with those Europe's 97 shows because those were such small clubs. You know, those audience tapes are unbelievable. But this, I just think that the tapers had their mics so close to the PA that you weren't picking up too much crowd. I mean, there is crowd noise, but it was the music into the microphone. So I think that's why, as you're talking about, it's such a great audience recording.
It is, and it's such a great opener, too, that it's fast, really fast. I hesitate to call it an organization, lest I give it some legitimacy, but the fan group of people for a louder mic that would develop soon after this. I can understand why people had the inclination to kind of unofficially petition the band to somehow turn up Mike's bass, because Trey is all the way up front in this sound and in this era, right? If you hear anything, so goes Trey, as goes Phish. Trey is all over the place, shredding at around 3 minutes. But Mike, he has a bass tone, but no body. There's nothing behind it. So Trey is kind of, Mike is almost like mixed in with Trey's playing. So I don't mean that as a criticism either, but it's just kind of an observation, an audio observation. I don't know. It was kind of hard for me to focus on the other members of the band just as I got used to this recording. But this Chalkless Torture is excellent. Trey's playing has a lot of personality, and what I noticed, just like you in high school, I was a drummer too, that Fishman's drum set sounds so big. As you mentioned earlier, they're getting used to this arena rock thing. It just is warp speed rock and roll by the end. And it's incredible that they can start a show like this and then even push up the energy even further after it.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. And I think during this period, I think it was 94 where Mike started using a pick rather than his fingers all the time. And I'm not a bass player, but I always wondered if you go to those like 92 soundboard shows, like during It's Ice and Split Open and Melt, you could hear Mike slapping the what out of the bass, to where all of a sudden he started using a pick, which kind of not dull, it's probably the wrong word, but it made his sound a little less. And as you said, they took away the soundboard patch. So now audience tapes weren't picking up Mike as much. And I think that had a lot to do with not hearing Mike so loud in the mix, but what do I know?
Right. What do any of us know until we hear it? And to follow up Chalkless Torture is Foam, which is a reliable two-hitter. It's always great to hear from, speaking of Mike, right? Well, you'd have to be deaf not to hear him at the beginning of this. And again, this became a recurring theme to my ears, that the tempo that they were playing in the fall of 95 is just mind-boggling, with a great piano solo at about 3 minutes, and then Trey kind of sneaks in, and he and Page are going back and forth at about 6.5 minutes, and then Fishman even gets in on it just with his snare drum. You mentioned this, that they weren't even really looking at each other. They were just playing telepathically. I think this Foam, although it's a fairly structured song that doesn't really get out of a type 1 jam space, this is a great example of what they were capable of at the time.
Yeah, they seemed this particular night, compared to the other nights of this Southern and Florida run, they had an extra pep in their step for whatever reason. I know that the day before they had the day off in Orlando, and I think that they had all gone to Disney World or Epcot that day before on their day off. And whatever happened there, they were definitely inspired and pretty fired up at this show. You could just tell out of the gate they were into it. It just seemed like, compared to the night before, the show before in Gainesville, and then even the next night in Tampa, they were just so into it. Like they had like a new espresso machine on their bus or something,
Right. They were inspired by It's a Small World.
Yeah, and again, the venue was so small, even compared to the next night at USF in Tampa and the gig before up at UF in Gainesville, which were pretty big, like 10,000 seat basketball arenas. And this, I don't know, don't quote me on it, but it definitely under 1,000 people.
The third song, which is Time for a Breather Now, and I didn't even mean to use that word, is Billy Breathes. Yeah, right.
Pretty
It's already
clever there.
sunk in. Is Billy Breathes. And I was surprised when I looked up the debut. It debuted on September 27th, the beginning of this fall tour at the Cal Expo Center. I didn't realize that it was already being played on the fall 95 tour.
Yeah, and at the time, obviously, if you weren't getting tapes, if you didn't have a tape hookup, you would just look on the set list on AOL Fishbowl. I don't think a deals page was around at the time. However, you would get your set list, you would see the song Billy Breathes and think, what is this song? Because it wasn't part of the Lowell, Mass batch of songs that debuted in May. So you're thinking, what is this Billy Breathes song? And in my opinion, it's one of their top ballads. And when played correctly, it's just a breath of fresh air. It was so cool that they played it the other night, I think, at Deer Creek during that epic second set on the that Sunday night, Deer Creek.
And also, this version of Billy Breathe is an early iteration of it, right? It's not fully baked. It's not the same version that you would hear tomorrow if they played it. It has a little bit more of an extended intro, and maybe Trey sounds a little, I don't know if this is the right word, but I wrote that he seems a little unsure of the vocal phrasing because it's very complicated. You brought up bouncing around the room earlier with that vocal, I don't know if it's a fugue, but certainly a vocal round where they kind of twist in and out of each other's vocal points. Billy Breathes has a complex vocal harmony section too. They are strong, but they do sound a little unpracticed. They were probably practicing it on the bus. Did you know this song at this time when you went to the show?
I knew of it because I had a couple of tapes from like the West Coast, and the run up the Midwest, Michigan, Louisville, Detroit, leading up to the Rosemont show. I remember going to those shows, and it was cool to hear the songs. And if you think about it, they're still working the song out. It's before they went and recorded it for Billy Breathes, so they're still working it out. And I remember to this theme, not from the bottom, haha. Taste, for instance, was known on the set list as The Fog That Surrounds because they added the whole Fishman step into space part. And on the set list, went from Taste from the Summer to all of a sudden it was called The Fog That Surrounds because it added like the step into space segment. Yeah. But the Billy Breathes, a lot of people were kind of looking around like, what's this? Because up to that point, was it Lifeboy, Fast Enough? There weren't a lot of ballads in their canon,
But your larger point is taken that it's a new ballad. A lot of people still, however many years later, consider it to be one of, if not their best, especially when it's played right, especially when it's nailed.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And you have to think that it's very personal to Trey because it's about one of his daughters. I believe his first daughter.
Yeah.
It's her nickname, and you got to think that it's obviously has a special meaning to him. So when he plays it, it obviously, probably tugs on his heartstrings a little bit.
And they kick it back up with Divided Sky.
Oh,
flawlessly played. Flawless. It's funny that you have continually brought up how small the room was by listening to this. And this is also a credit to the tapers. Right at the pause, the crowd is going nuts. And I thought, wow, this must be a really big room.
Yeah, quite the opposite. But I think also half the crowd had never seen Phish before. You could tell there was the little contingent that was on tour, but you could tell there was a lot of people there that were seeing Phish for the first time and didn't get the whole pause to be quiet during that point. And, when they do the pause, they just stand there frozen.
Right.
And everyone's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? I think some people thought the song was over even, to give it like a, hey, all right. Where a lot of us are looking around waiting for the bing, that part.
And when they come back in with that part, they play so quietly. They always do. They're almost like challenging the crowd to stay quiet.
Oh, yeah. At this point in Phish's career, their dynamics are incredible where they can just blaze like chalk dust torture, but then get so quiet. And later on, when we get into the stash, talk about dynamics. That's what I was always impressed about Phish was how they could just bring it down so quiet. so quiet that boom, like, blow the room apart,
Which they do at the end of This Divided Sky. I know that
Oh.
95 and 94 was kind of the peak of Machine Gun Trey, but this is more almost rugged, the end of The Divided Sky, when you're used to the big slippery guitar solos and the crazy back A section, B section of the rest of the band, the other three guys. I wrote that this has bigger swirls of sound and rhythm playing as opposed to chaotic, slippery guitar madness. I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to it to know what I meant when I wrote it myself. But this does sound kind of like an atypical ending of Divided Sky for the time.
Oh, definitely. And if you even go back to the last Divided Sky up in Atlanta at the Fox Theater, that end, like, it just seemed like they were really going for it at the last part of Divided Sky to, like, the awesome little ending. It just kept going and going and going and going. And this is, like you said, they're really going for it almost, because that's the great part of that thing of Divided Sky. There's so many different pieces, and that last ending where Trey's just ripping and going and going and building, but it just there's nothing like a great Divided Sky.
I agree, and this was the time for it. I have to ask, you brought up a little bit earlier about looking around and seeing like a small contingent who was on tour, and you also suggested that it was probably a bunch of people seeing Phish for the first time. What did the crowd look like? I know that you said your first show was in 1990. I guess this is two questions in a row. I guess the first one I would ask is, had you been seeing them consistently between your first show and this show in 95? Were you constantly seeing them, or as much as you could? Okay. And what did the crowd look like by 95? How did it change from when you saw them originally in 1990?
Well, I would say from 1990, the Poughkeepsie show, the 92 Portchester shows, the Capitol Theater, the Thanksgiving shows, that's when I really noticed the long hair, quote unquote, wook contingent kind of joining the fray. So you had a lot of clean cut, college looking type folks, but then the hippie element started really coming in just a little bit. By 95, obviously, we know Jerry passed, and a lot of that, the road dogs of like the dead scene needed something to do. So let's jump on the Phish bandwagon. And I noticed there were a lot more dreadlocks, a lot more patchouli oil, and there was more of a lot scene where people weren't there really for the shows. They were just there trying to make a living, where that wasn't really a big part of Phish prior to 1994. There's little pockets of it, but by fall of 95, especially West Coast, the West Coast tour of 95 really had the Grateful Dead contingent because they needed somewhere to do their thing, unfortunately and fortunately.
That makes sense. If you're from, especially Northern California, the Bay Area, and that was your thing year round, what now?
In the hippie world, I mean, once the Dead were done, there wasn't really much else to go follow around unless you wanted to do Rainbow Gathering Tour, if that's even a thing, but
Yeah. Well, after Divided Sky, they again slow things down a bit, but don't quite take it down. It's not simpler; it's just as difficult with Esther. And I
Oh
wanted
yeah.
to ask in Esther in a big basketball gym, and I've heard Esther played at Madison Square Garden, but when they're in this kind of in between area, they're at the end of making their bones professionally. But as you indicated earlier, in a Southeast tour or in Florida, they're not really that popular, where they're still drawing crowds of less than 1,000, but they're playing big, not big basketball arenas, but big for that crowd number. How does a song like Esther carry in an arena like this?
From what I remember, it was pretty good, but I think when they get into the really the quiet parts, and then when Trey's doing like the volume swells, that my friend who I took, he goes, "Oh, this sounds like La Villa Strangiata by Rush." The volume swell parts. You could tell a lot of people started kind of like, all right, they start chatting, people going to the bathroom kind of thing, and getting into whatever they're getting into. I always found with Phish fans, you have like when they get into these really complicated parts, sometimes it loses a lot of people. Like when Gaiuti became like a thing again, the real hardcore hippies didn't like Gaiuti because it was, it just wasn't a thing you could dance to. Where Esther kind of gets a little froggy because there's a lot of things going on. So it wasn't really, the non-fans or the new fans weren't really engaged in it as much to say like I was, because Esther, I think, is a masterpiece.
Yeah, and these days when I see it, especially at Madison Square Garden, it works, to your point, as long as people are quiet.
Yes, and if Phish practiced it.
Well, yeah, that's always the umbrella, the asterisk there. As far as arenas go, so after Esther, they slam right into Free, which debuted
uh,
just a couple months earlier. Like you mentioned this show earlier on May 16th, 95 in Lowell, the Voters for Choice benefit. So it's been around for 6 months already. But with the length of the fall 95 tour, it feels like it's been around forever. It sounds like an old favorite. It's not a new song per se, even though it technically is. This is the first time I noticed in this show that Trey goes onto his percussion kit and
yeah,
they
so I
go
was just
into a
going to bring
big
it up.
sonic drone. The guitar is still being strummed every now and again, but it's more like a big swirl than a rhythm part.
Yeah, and you could tell that's when Trey kind of kicks on that weird loop, puts the guitar behind his back, and starts playing his little percussion jam. And it just gets into that zone where I do remember looking around, and you could tell the crowd was kind of in this hypnotic trance, just bobbing their head in time to it. And I remember my friend Greg Wickstrom, shout out. He thought that really had a King Crimson vibe to it. He's like, man, we're getting Rush and King Crimson in the same show, because he kind of went into the show expecting a Grateful Dead kind of thing to it. His stereotype was that Phish was the new Grateful Dead, so he was expecting a lot of noodling, and he was so blown away by Foam, which we'll get into later with the Mike Gordon situation. But he was like, "Oh, there's so much strip going on right now," which was pretty
Yeah,
cool to hear.
I had the same thought. I had the same thought that it was more of like a wall of sound than it was straight rock and roll.
Oh yeah, they weren't doing a compare, especially now when Mike kind of leads the free jam these days. You know how they've been doing it, but this is just that awesome hypnotic thing. And one thing I wanted to note about this first set, you pretty much get everything that Phish has to offer. You get the rocker, the real tight, the dynamics of Divided Sky and Esther. We'll get into Julius and everything, and Blue and Lonesome, and you get into this big arena rock. Because if you notice, when they start playing these big places, when they do the free, it just fills out these bigger rooms, and this is like a perfect vehicle for that.
Yeah, they do. They do get a little bit more. Well, you mentioned Julius, and it's next. It's a good placement, I thought, after Free, something a little more predictable, something a little bit more
Right.
constant, where at the end of Free, Fishman is kind of the only one that's playing something that you could grab onto with your ears and with your brain, right? Everything else is swirling in the universe. Like it's the middle of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the film, not the song. But Julius is just straightforward rock and roll. Like there's an impressive, consistent lick at about 3 minutes and 45 seconds from Trey because he's usually all over the place. But otherwise, I feel like this is standard, whip up the audience into a frenzy. And you could hear them using a lot of tricks they may have picked up while rehearsing for Quadrophenia, where they kind of like do this call and response within each other, within the band to play to a large audience.
Yes, and this is the point in the show where the crowd it turned into a dance party. I mean, the swinging shuffle groove, the place was just going nuts, arms flailing, the typical hippie running in place dance that they do with the arms flailing all over the place. The place was going bonkers at this point. I mean, it went full on yeehaw. And it was awesome to watch. And I always love looking around at the crowd and being like, heck yeah, the crowd is getting it on. And I thought for sure the set was going to end right here after this song. I mean, the way they're peaking it up, I just thought for sure this was going to be the end of the set.
Yeah, it feels like a closer. And I also, by the way, just as an aside, I love looking around during a
It's
Phish
the
show.
best.
And I always have the kind of paranoid feeling that I'm freaking out the people right behind me because they always think I'm turning around to look at them specifically, but I'm not.
Right.
I always tell people who I'm bringing to a first show or people who are going to a first show and they reach out to me and like they're excited to tell me I'm going to see Phish. I always tell them it's great people watching.
Oh,
It's the best there is, better than any airport you'll ever go to.
It's unreal. I mean, there's nothing better. Yeah. And looking around the room, that's why as the years went on, my favorite spot to see Phish is behind the stage, just to look at what the band's looking at, just watching the whole room, just getting the F down. It's got to be thrilling for Phish just to look at a room of like 18,000 people just losing their minds. I mean, they must feel like, yep, we're doing it.
Well, they are doing it. And you mentioned when people were dancing during Julius, giddy up. They do giddy it up at the next song, I'm Blue, I'm Lonesome. Yeah, I even wrote, I figured this set would end with Julius. So this is kind of like a cool bonus. They owned their acoustic bluegrass during the fall 94 tour. So I'm curious what inspired this choice. I don't know. Maybe it's the smaller crowd that you mentioned, possibly.
Yeah.
But the Shushers have their work cut out for them during this one, too.
Yeah, because at this point, I remember they kind of came out where Page is playing the upright bass. They kind of come out to the front of the stage. They're not on their instruments. I think they debuted this song earlier out west, like in Shoreline or somewhere out there. And we kind of thought this was a little nod or tribute to Jerry's passing. Like, man, I'm blue and I'm lonesome. So whenever they came out and did this with Page on the upright and Fishman on the mandolin and that sort of thing. And I think Fishman's playing the banjo. No, Fishman on the banjo. Mike's playing the
upright.
Fishman on the mandolin. Yeah, and Trey's playing acoustic. They all come out. The note that always gets me is Page hitting that "I Want to Cry." That segment always nails it. Or they would do $2 Bill or Long Journey Home, whatever it's called. And I thought for sure that this was a tribute to Jerry and the Dead kind of thing. This was their little nod.
I never thought of it at that angle, but that's certainly a good interpretation. It makes sense when you think about it from that lens. It was played, by the way, 18 times this tour. So it's not a rarity for Fall 95. And I was going to say, after it's over, Trey says that they're going to take a break, and he tells the audience about the chess game. And if anyone wants to make a move, they should go to the Greenpeace table. And of course, he even says, if you want to make a move, like if you want to surrender, if you want to end the game, or give in, you do that, because they're competitive. It's a joke and it's fun and it's audience interaction, but damn, they want to win for sure. But they're not done because they play Cavern to close the set.
Yes, and the one thing that Cavern is just kind of looked at, okay, it's Cavern, other than like a 91 tour with the horns or whatever, Cavern's a pretty straightforward song, except for like, the Island Tour, Providence Cavern. But and after 93, Fishman started playing Cavern a little different. It always had like a closed hi-hat backbeat kind of groove. And then in 94, he started playing with open hi-hats and more like a boom, bash, boom, bash, instead of boom, da boom, ba. And then this particular, I remember Deer Creek 95, whenever they would play Cavern, I have in my notes, after the first verse, Trey would do this vocal chant. Oh, like screaming, and it sounded kind of evil and weird. And so for people listening, go back to Deer Creek 95 on your live Phish app, and this on the live Phish app. Just listen to after the first verse of Cavern, he does this like weird chant kind of thing, and they're playing more like atonal dissonant riffs kind of thing, which is very atypical for your Cavern.
And he does it along with what he's playing, like wow, like he'll sing along with his playing. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and on this tour, especially up in like Kalamazoo and Louisville, he was doing that George Benson, O'Teal Burbridge scat thing where he would kind of scat along with his notes kind of thing. He was kind of really into that on the fall 95 tour. I remember at the time looking at my journal, he was really into that sort of thing. He kind of drop into that little phrasing style.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
So that's only the first set. We have a whole nother set to go.
I know.
Set 2 opens with Maze, which is an amazing way to start the set. And when I see Fall 95 Maze set 2 opener, I get a little nervous and a little scared in an excited way. When people say evil Phish, this is more anxious Phish for me personally.
Yeah.
Page has an amazing organ solo that begins at 3.5 minutes. But as always, my ear is drawn to Fishman's bass drum. His right foot must be made of jello.
Yeah, he's channeling his John Bonham, because in my opinion, John Bonham's right foot next to Bruce Lee has to be the most amazing right foot of all time, And like you said, I'm not amazed. It's just
Yeah, it's really impressive. But even after you pay attention to Fishman, all of a sudden Trey is doing some ascending jazz chords, but it's really all Page for the first half of it. This version is on the Phish.net jam charts. It's described as, quote, an insane Trey section, and then they call it psychedelic, which I agree with. And maybe they're referring to about 9 minutes, which has a whiff of Stash to me. It's telling that a highlighted version of Maze sounds like almost any other version from this time period. I love this Maze.
Oh, this maze is really cool. And if you go to the 11-minute mark, Trey's getting kind of to his peak of the guitar solo, but he starts once again doing that vocal scatting thing. But he starts doing this like over the thing, which is really psychedelic. And I remember kind of looking around the crowd and people that might have been on a head full or whatever, you could tell they were kind of having this like, oh, what the hell's going on? It was like kind of like the evil Phish kind of thing going on at the time. So to anyone who's going to go back to listen to this, the 11-minute mark, there's just one weird section that he's just doing this like kind of thing along with his guitar solo, which is very atypical for Maze.
And they cool down a little bit after with Gumbo, which is very relaxed. I really liked this. And even though I'm, what is this now? 29 years since it was played, I was listening to it on my couch. I still needed a cool down after Maze. So I was really glad to get this Gumbo right after. And the vocals especially sounded relaxed, but otherwise it's a pretty straightforward, pleasant version of Gumbo.
Yeah, because at this point, Gumbo's Gumbo, but everyone thinks of like the Gumbo with horns, especially from the live one. It has the giant country horns, or I think that version is the cosmic country horns. But Gumbo is either Gumbo, or unless they did a show with the horns, Gumbo was pretty straightforward until the 97 versions of Gumbo when they would stretch it out a little bit, And who doesn't love a good gumbo or to eat a great bowl of gumbo?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'll see you down in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
After Gumbo, this is apparently where things got wacky, and this is what inspired you to reach out to me. So I'm just going to say what the set list reads, and then we'll start back from the beginning and take us through it. So the next song after Gumbo is Stash, into Manteca, back into Stash, then into Dogface Boy, and then closes with Stash. The set is not over. There's more to go after that. But this is the beginning of the sequence that kind of puts this show on the map. And the first thing you mentioned when you asked to cover this show.
To me, this is one of the greatest segments of Phish in their history. Prior to this show, the best thing I had seen from Phish was the 94 Summer Big Birch show. After Big Birch, they do all these amazing shows and everything, but that was like the pinnacle. And up until that point, I hadn't seen Phish reach that level from the Big Birch show until this version of Stash. And at first I'm thinking, whoa, a second set Stash. That's kind of weird because Stash is generally a first set song. I know that sometimes up to that point, like Great Woods 94, the Game Hen show, they play an amazing second set Stash, but it's not very typical for Phish to play Stash with a second set, especially a third song in. I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting, a mid-second set Stash. Huh. and it starts off like just like any other stash. But then, I always thought, like in the beginning, there's that mute picking staccato part, like the 323 mark.
Down at a grand fish minus two. Police in the corner, got it for you. Apple toast baby, eat it like a rat. The trophies and things can't be bought. The solar planet starts to run. Who's it for this my life I saw? Maybe so, baby, so
He does like this.
Yeah, it crawls right up your spine.
Oh God, and he's never done this before or after. And it was so atypical. And again, shout out to Jim Charner, the taper, who got us tapes like the day after, that anyone who I shared this tape with, everyone loved the
Yeah,
because
I do.
it was, it's so atypical for a stash. And you could kind of tell they released this on video, Phish. So when they do it, you can kind of look at Trey and they look around at each other with like that shit-eating grin,
You can tell that this is something he's been playing with and practicing on the bus or backstage or whatever. And then he's just so excited to break it out. I could picture that image of those of you at home listening. Matthew just kind of did his best impression of Trey's shit-eating grin of looking back and forth. I could just picture it in my head of him like trying out something new that they all know he can do it and what it sounds like. But in the audience, it's all new to us. So it's really fun to hear. Around 6 minutes, the first proper jam begins. To me, it sounded like 25 or 6-4 by Chicago.
Oh. Absolutely. I kind of was looking like they're not going to go into a Chicago jam, are they? Like that was kind of my mind. It was so pronounced. Or my friend that was with me thought it was Zeppelin, Babe, I'm Going to Leave You. Dun, 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 dun,
Yeah,
dun,
yeah.
dun. And there was a little bit of that kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, it rocks pretty strong at that point. And then after that point, it all leads up to 12 minutes where Trey goes back to his muted picking again. And Fishman is mostly on the wood blocks and the cowbell. Like very interesting instrumentation in the thick of this jam before they delve into Manteca.
Yeah, and this is where you can really hear Mike Gordon. This is the genius of Mike Gordon's bass playing, and what separates him from like your typical back in the drummer bass player. Like all four of them basically at this point are doing totally different things. Fishman's on like the hi-hat, the wood block, and it just starts to get really weird. The lights, Perota's, getting the room like all wacky. You could just feel it starts getting like this weird, eerie kind of feeling in the crowd. People start looking around, and I'm just listening. I'm like, what are they doing? Like what's happening here?
What's happening is after Manteca, they go back into Stash, or it picks up right where it left off on a descending chord progression. It sounds like more straight rock and roll to me than like the typical Latin jazz that Stash usually provides.
Right.
It settles down at around, I'm using the timing from Phish.in, so this is that second version of Stash. It settles down at about 3 minutes, but the tempo and the music doesn't change, just kind of the dynamics, which you mentioned earlier as kind of their expertise in 1995. There's this really fun transition at about 4 minutes and 40 seconds to this Leslie Speaker drenched exploration. It doesn't sound like it's going to end anytime soon, like pleasant planetarium music. And then a minute later, I could hear a minor key pivot back to what, again, might become Stash, but it doesn't. It just floats, strangely, I should add, into Dog-Faced Boy, which if you gave me 100 guesses and listed 100 Phish songs in front of me and said, what is this jam going to lead into? I would never pick Dog-Faced Boy.
No, and this is at the time a very different version of Dog-Faced Boy. Besides the great Philly Spectrum 97 version of Dog-Faced Boy, this is a very eerie, because right before the transition to Dog-Faced Boy, the Stash, when they go from Manteca, it gets really funky. Like they're kind of like foreshadowing what's going to come like a couple of years into the quote unquote cow funk period. They're playing like a very, very, Page Clav led funk jam. But then, like you said, the dynamics get really close, and the lights are getting odd. And if I remember correctly, they were blowing some fog machine smoke onto the stage. So it was like very dark, and people were kind of looking around like you could tell that it was getting a little uncomfortable in the room.
Well, the Dog-Faced Boy, I just want to take a minute and describe what it sounds like, because I imagine for most listeners to this podcast who haven't heard this show or this version, it's easy to toss aside when you hear that Dog-Faced Boy was played in a song, because 99% of the time you know how it's going to go. But Trey sings the lyrics with this odd drone sound in the background. It's almost a cappella, but a cappella and creepy. It's almost like they're making up these vocal harmonies in real time.
dog-faced boy. I won't lend another hand to the warm girl of a boy. Don't deplete my oxygen for the guy who's turning blue. But ask me, and I'll do anything for you. Whenever I think of you, it only makes me feel sad. Whenever I think of you, the best friend I ever had.
When I went back and checked on Phish.net, it's described as, and this is a quote, haunting. And I agree with that, which is not a word that I would ever use to describe Dog-Faced Boy. And then it ends, the song proper ends, but the track still goes on for 2 more minutes of this long drone of feedback. They're really challenging the audience. Like, what can you take? Something familiar, and we're just going to mess with it. Can you take it?
Yes, and this is where they go back into that King Crimson kind of Robert Fripptronic kind of era. And I remember right before that fall run, I had seen King Crimson in their Vroom era right before in the Mahaffey Theater in St. Pete. And this reminded me, I remember on my notes at the time, it was like weird evil King Crimson jam kind of thing with, like, again, looking around, it was making people uncomfortable. You could tell people were not getting what they were doing kind of thing,
Right,
and like
which they still do, right? It's always a risk when they do that. And 95 and also portions of 94 are known for that, right? They were just kind of pushing against whatever is expected. Like, we're going to get weird. Can you take it?
Yeah, like the Vegas Halloween 98 Wolfmans. They really try to push like how far you could take it. That's you're either into that sort of thing or you're not into that sort of thing. That kind of separates the fandom, if you will.
Yeah, and this is a conversation for another time, but one could argue during that Wolfman's in 98, the Halloween 98, maybe it was too much even for them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Trey basically says, all right, I'm out a little bit after that,
But just to close this sequence, they get back into Stash just for one final time. This is just kind of to close the sequence, to put the second piece of bread on the sandwich, so to speak. But boy, what a sequence it was, right? There was an extended applause when Stash ends, and then they cool down with a prime time version of Strange Design. Beautiful, kind of like Billy Breathes in that it's very pleasant. Page's vocals finally come to the forefront, and more of that Leslie Speaker guitar effect that I'm so in love with from 1995. So an excellent version of Strange Design before they close the whole set with You Enjoy Myself into a quoted immigrant song tease, and then closes with You Enjoy Myself proper. So this feels like it's just a tag along at the end of the set, but it's not. It's really pleasant and rocking to end the show.
Yeah, again, like, in the intro of your podcast, you asked me, what's a show that you would want to turn someone on to? And this particular show, because of this, You Enjoy Myself, this show literally has everything. It's got the Chicago tease in the beginning of Stash, and then you throw in the little Led Zeppelin segment. I mean, at this point, this is just like the cherry on top. You Enjoy is flawless, and then once they go into skaboo, and they start screaming la 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 la, the place is going absolutely bananas. I mean, it kind of went back to the Julius part, but on another level. I mean, the place was literally, I thought the ceiling was going to pop off at the gym. I mean, it was just like, yes, this is why we Phish. And then they go into the vocal jam, and then it got everyone, like all the non-Phish people, uncomfortable again. Everyone's looking around again, like the Dog-Faced Boy segment, kind of like, what is going on here? What is this? Because how the vocal jam, you're either into it or you're not into it, and it's always better in person, I think, than on tape. It works better.
Yeah, of course. But I don't want to forget or brush over. There's a part in between the immigrant song and the vocal jam. It's like the second chunk of the You Enjoy Myself jam, that there's a back and forth between Trey and Fishman, where Trey will play a riff and then pause, and Fishman will respond to it, like a call and response part. And that caught my eye, or my ear, I should say, caught my ear. And I thought that's a beautiful example of expressing their improvisation practices that they do backstage and offstage all the time. I don't know if you know the part I'm talking about. It's at 13 minutes. And that's why I never, ever fast forward through You Enjoy Myself, even though it's not always as creative as this one is.
Yeah, this kind of harkens on to why Phish was so different than most bands. Was before they got into like the Farmhouse original Tab trio material, Mike Gordon and Fishman didn't lock up like your typical rhythm section. You know, most bands, the drummer and the bassist kind of hold the groove down. I always thought this was a perfect example of how Trey and Fishman kind of link up, kind of like in a couple of weeks, the New Haven Tweezer, where it's Fishman and Trey are kind of they're the rhythm section leading the band. And I thought this is the perfect section. Why, like in Trey's barn, there's that big mural of Fishman basically on the ceiling, you know?
Yeah, and that's kind of their nucleus, where it's more of an organization instrumentally like a jazz band as opposed to a rock band, where the drum set is more about playing melodies. The bass is really holding down the rhythm by itself, but the drums are not always there with the bass.
Yeah, that was always a thing that bothered, because you know everyone gets supplanted in their musical brain that the drums and bass hold down the fort while the other instruments and vocals kind of do their thing. But I always thought that that's what separated Phish from most bands, is how Fishman and Trey were the rhythm section, and Mike kind of like dilly-dalled his way around those two, which why Mike Gordon is the most unique bass player in rock and roll, in my opinion. You know, he's kind of the secret weapon, what makes Phish Phish.
And their encore is made up of The Wedge, which, other than the introduction, which we don't get to hear anymore, it's a pretty fun, usual version. And then Rocky Top to close the whole show, which is a really fast, insane, loving version of Rocky Top.
Yeah, I always, as a drummer, love the intro of The Wedge, and I don't know why they don't do it anymore. Usually, maybe it's they play it out of a jam and Trey does it. But you could tell the feeling in the room. Everyone was just smiles, and everyone was just singing, you know, a two-car garage. And The Wedge wasn't really an encore. That's not a song that they encored with. And that, you know, it's one of my favorite songs. I always thought The Wedge was one of the only Phish songs that really sounded like a Grateful Dead song, if you think about it, the rhythm section kind of thing. And at that point, then Rocky Top, that was just, all right, we're going to send you off into the night, into the Orlando night. Just, okay, this is, because you know whenever they end with Rocky Top, excuse me, that usually means they played a great show, in my opinion, if you kind of look at the history of Phish shows.
Yeah. And we're done with the show itself, but I would be remiss as a host. You brought up, just in bits and pieces throughout our conversation, meeting Mike Gordon. And we didn't get into that story. So what happened when you met Mike Gordon?
So the reason I reached out to you to pick this specific show was before the show it was a pretty small parking lot scene. And everyone knows that Mike Gordon's known for kind of roaming around the parking lot, either in a golf cart or just kind of walking around the parking lot, saying hi to the fans. This particular night, Mike Gordon was literally just standing by himself in the middle of the parking lot. And again, this was a tiny little place. And I had taken my friend Greg Wickstrom, who had never really he heard a couple of Phish songs. He loved Foam because of the bass line. And this guy's a monster bass player. He's like one of the monster bass players in the Tampa Bay area. Shout out to Greg. And I said, you have to come see this band Phish. I bought him a ticket and I said, please come. Tickets on me. You have to go see this band. And I said, wow, Mike Gordon's just standing there. I'm like, we have to go say hi to him. So we wandered over to him. We're like, Mike, oh my God, it's so great to see you. I said, thank you for the amazing run in Fox Theater. And I just asked him, because at the time I started really getting into jazz and I was going to music school and taking jazz band. So I was into I loved that Phish would play jazz standards. And I asked him, hey, how come you guys don't play Manteca anymore? Is there like a reason you never do that? I'm like, and previously the last time played was the Roxy in Atlanta, which I believe was 2/21/93. And before that, it wasn't like a common Phish song, once they started playing bigger places, they really kind of cut the jazz standards out. And he gave me the old, well, I don't make the set list really. He's like, yeah, I like that song too. And then I told him, and I said, my friend Greg here, this is his first show. He's a bass player and he loves Foam. I said, man, if you guys could if there's any way you could play Foam, he would freak out. And then Greg mentioned something to him about technical bass stuff about oh, do you use these pickups or whatever? So it went from me being the Phish nerd, then Mike kind of lit up and those two started bass nerding out about Galen Kruger bass heads. And I think he was relieved to talk bass rather than Phish nerd kind of thing, So I'm not saying that it could be a coincidence that they played Manteca, but I feel that conversation was the reason that we got that monster stash Teca, if you will. That's why I wanted to bring this up to you. And I thought it was a good reason to throw this on the attendance bias, because perhaps that's my attendance bias to why I think this is a top 20 Phish show of all time.
Matthew, thank you so much for taking your time, for obviously doing your research, but really bringing us back to November 14th, 1995 at the UCF Arena, really bringing us into the scene and speaking for myself and hopefully for my listeners, feeling like we were there with you. So thank you again for coming on to tell your story about this show.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure. I think your podcast is amazing. And to anyone that's listening right now, really seek out this show. And there's Phish released a video of this. So it's really worth watching if you can find it.
And that's it for today's conversation with Matthew. But we got to make sure we got everything right after going so many decades of Phish history. Let's make sure we got everything just perfect.
Attendance bias fact check.
The UCF Arena is still on the UCF campus, but it is not nearly the same building. The original opened in 1991, but it was renovated in 2006 when a new arena, the Addition Financial Arena, was opened on campus for men's and women's basketball. The original arena is still open, and it can be configured for smaller capacity sports such as volleyball, as well as theater performances. But at the time of this Phish performance, the capacity was 5,100 people. The Chance in Poughkeepsie appears to be closed at the time of this recording. It had an official capacity of 900 people. When discussing The Landlady as the first song Matthew heard live, he compares it to the playing of Carlos Santana. At the song's debut on September 13, 1990 at the Wetlands in New York City, Trey outright dedicates the song to, quote, the spirit of Carlos, so he must have done something right. During the long Midnight to Sunrise set at Big Cypress, Fishman did play the signature opening drum roll to Harry Hood before the band began to play 2001. Most fans refer to this as the Hood Fakeout. I've always thought that Fishman just completely forgot that the band played Harry Hood during the second set on the first day of Big Cypress, because by the time he played it during the Midnight to Sunrise set, the band had already been playing for over 6 hours. Fake out or just a plain mistake, all can be forgiven at Big Cypress. When discussing Phish's ascent in the 1993 to 1995 era, Matthew brings up the band's show at the Mid-Hudson Civic Center. This show is played on February 12, 1993, and it has been referenced at least once before on this podcast when the band played Michael Jackson's Black or White in the middle of Harpua, among dozens of other setlist notes and antics. According to the Phish.com archives, the lineup for I'm Blue, I'm Lonesome was Trey on acoustic guitar, Mike on banjo, Page on upright bass, and Fishman on mandolin. And finally, as mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this episode was recorded during Phish's 2024 summer tour. So when Matthew references Billy Breathes being played, quote, the other night at Deer Creek, he is referencing August 4th, 2024, when the ballad was played in the middle of a huge second set. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Matthew for joining me today, Phish.net for their help with the fact check, the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do for children's music education, and Phish.in for the amazing recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show. You could leave a rating or a review of it on your favorite podcast app. You could follow Attendance Bias on social media, and you can go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendance bias and donate anything you can. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.